At the dinner I hosted to celebrate my retirement, after 40 years of working, my younger sister placed her hand over my husband's in front of everyone and announced that she was pregnant with his child. 60 years of life, 40 years of marriage. And just like that, at a table set with white orchids and wine glasses, everything I had built was put on the line in a single sentence. They expected me to fall apart right then and there, to cry, to beg, to hand over everything just to avoid a scandal. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out a manila envelope they didn't even know existed, and placed it on the table. I will never forget the color draining from their faces. But before I continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. I had spent 3 weeks planning that dinner with a level of care that only someone who has spent their entire life organizing things for other people could truly understand. It wasn't just any dinner. It was my retirement party. The celebration of 40 years working as an accountant at a commercial construction firm in Seattle, arriving early, leaving late, solving the messes other people created and didn't know how to clean up. 40 years of spreadsheets, financial reports, and meetings where I was the only one who had actually read the documents before walking into the room. And finally, at 60 years old, I had decided it was time to stop. That it was my turn. I booked the restaurant 3 weeks in advance. I personally selected the menu, spoke with the maitre d' about the details, and asked them to place white orchids in the center of the table because they were my mother's favorite flower. She had passed away 6 years ago, and I wanted to feel her presence in some way during that celebration. I invited the people I loved, my husband Richard, my sister Denise, my sister-in-law Nancy, and 2 couples who were old friends we shared decades of history with. I was happy. Not just happy. I was at peace, which is something completely different and much rarer. That word, peace, had taken decades to make sense inside of me. My name was Barbara. Barbara Hayes before I got married, Barbara Miller afterward, but deep down I was always the Barbara who learned early on that no one was going to fix anything for her if she didn't fix it herself. The oldest daughter of a blue-collar family from rural Idaho, I learned how to work before I learned how to rest. I learned to be useful before I learned to be happy. My mother used to say I was born serious, that not even as a baby did I cry over nothing, as if I already knew life was going to demand a lot from me. I was 6 when my sister Denise was born. 7 years separated us, and those 7 years were worth an entire generation within our family. Denise was born premature, tiny, with a pair of blue eyes that looked like they were painted on, and she instantly became the center of our domestic universe. My mom called her God's little gift. My dad called her his princess. I was called the responsible one, which in practice meant I carried the heaviest grocery bags, washed the dishes while she dried them, when she remembered, and watched her whenever my mom needed to run errands. I grew up hearing that I was the strong one and she was the delicate one. I internalized that without question, because children internalize whatever adults repeat, and for decades, that script functioned as an unspoken rule between us. I produced, she needed. I gave, she received. I held the ground, she wavered. I didn't hold a grudge for a long time, because I thought that was just how things were, that families had these predefined roles, and my role had been drawn before I even had a say in the matter. Richard walked into my life when I was 22. He was handsome in that deceptive way, the kind where it takes you a while to distinguish charm from character because they look exactly the same on the outside. He sold industrial equipment, lived on the road, always had a new story, always had a joke ready, always capable of lightening the mood of any room just by being there. I fell in love with that lightness, because I carried so much responsibility on my back that I thought a man like him would balance me out. That life beside him would be easier to breathe through. For 40 years, it worked. At least, that's what I thought. Today I understand that what actually worked was me adapting to his dead weight without realizing I was doing the heavy lifting yet again. That night, I arrived at the restaurant a half hour before everyone else, like always. I've been like that since I was a kid. Punctuality is almost a compulsion for me. I sat in the seat I reserved for myself, facing the door so I could see everyone walking in, another old habit of someone taught to keep an eye on everything. I ordered a sparkling water, looked at the white orchids, thought about my mother, thought about the 40 years, and thought about what it would be like to wake up on Monday morning without having an obligation to be anywhere. Richard arrived 15 minutes later. He walked in with Denise, which didn't surprise me because he had told me he was spending the afternoon at her apartment helping fix a broken shower head. She lived about 20 minutes from the restaurant, so it made sense they carpooled. I should have paid closer attention to the way they walked in. Denise looked different that night. She was wearing a dress that didn't suit her usual style, too tight, too colorful, too flashy for a Tuesday night family dinner. Her hair was down and she was wearing bold red lipstick, the kind of choice you make when you want to be noticed. She was 53 years old and behaving with a nervous energy I hadn't seen in her since she was a teenager. Richard was a step behind her, tugging at his shirt collar, his eyes darting over people's heads as if he was looking for an emergency exit that never materialized. I hugged them both when they reached the table. Richard's hug was short, distracted, the kind of embrace from someone thinking about something else entirely. Denise's was far too tight, suffocating, the way someone acts when their body is consumed by nerves and they don't know what to do with their hands. The other guests trickled in. The table filled up. The conversation flowed, the wine was good, the food arrived in the right order, and I kept pushing that strange, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach into a corner, convincing myself it was just anxiety about the milestone, that it was a big night and it made sense to feel tense. That's when I raised my glass to make a toast. I spoke about gratitude, about the 40 years, about what it meant to reach 60 in good health, with a fulfilling career, surrounded by the people I loved at a beautiful table. I was almost finished speaking when Denise interrupted. Her voice cut through the air of the restaurant with a clarity that was entirely intentional. She said she also had some news to share. And then, in that second that seemed to stretch into hours, she placed her hand over Richard's hand, right there, in front of everyone, in front of our friends, my sister-in-law, the waiter standing 6 feet away, and said she was pregnant, and that the baby was his. The silence that settled over that table was the kind of silence that physically hurts. The shock I expected to feel lasted less time than anyone would imagine. It was maybe 30 seconds of free fall, that feeling of the floor vanishing beneath your feet, of the walls closing in, the sound muting. And then the shock was replaced by something completely different, by memories. One after another, in rapid, merciless succession, as if my brain had been waiting for this exact moment to finally organize a filing cabinet it had been keeping without my permission. Richard saying he was going to help Denise paint her apartment on a Friday night. Richard arriving late to my birthday dinner because her car had broken down and he had to pick her up. Denise calling on weekends whenever I was out of the house, and Richard taking the call in the bedroom with the door shut, emerging with that slightly uncomfortable look of someone who had been interrupted. Cancelled dinners with vague excuses. Work trips that miraculously lasted one day longer than necessary. Little absences that I had swallowed one by one with the most reasonable explanation I could invent, because it was easier to believe the excuses than my own instincts. At that table, while the guests exchanged bewildered glances, not knowing where to look, I stared right at Richard. He couldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on some empty spot in the center of the table, like a man who knows he's stepped on a landmine and is waiting for a miracle before he takes his foot off. Denise, on the other hand, looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in our entire lives. It was a mix of triumph and fear, exactly like someone who just pulled the pin on a grenade and hasn't yet calculated how far to run. I excused myself. I stood up with the calm demeanor of someone concluding a business meeting that wrapped up ahead of schedule. I said goodbye to our friends without explaining anything, said I wasn't feeling well and needed some air. I grabbed my purse, my coat, and walked out of the restaurant with the exact same composure I would have used to walk out of any difficult corporate negotiation over the last 40 years. I only let the tears fall once I was inside my car. I cried for about 10 minutes in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, the engine off, the Seattle rain tapping against the roof like white noise making the silence even heavier. Then I dried my face with the tissue I always carry in my purse, started the engine, and drove home. Richard didn't come back that night. He texted me saying he was crashing at a buddy's place, that we needed to talk calmly the next day, that there was a lot to explain. I didn't reply. I sat in the dark living room of the condo we bought together 28 years ago, staring at the photos on the bookshelf without turning on a single lamp. Vacation photos. Family Christmases. Photos from our 30th anniversary party, which I had planned months in advance, where I wore a navy blue dress he told me was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. I kept staring at those pictures and asked myself a question that hurt more than anything else: when exactly did I stop seeing what was happening inside my own home? But there's something about turning 60 that nobody tells you while you're still young. You stop being afraid of certain losses. Not because they don't hurt, they hurt like hell, sometimes more than anything that came before. But because you've already lost things, you've survived things you thought would break you, and at some point, your internal resistance system simply becomes more robust than your capacity for despair. You learn that pain passes. That you keep going even when you're absolutely certain you can't. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to humiliate myself. I wasn't going to cry in front of them demanding an explanation. And I definitely wasn't going to hand over anything I had built with 40 years of hard work to two people who spent that time betraying me behind my back. It was in that moment, sitting in the dark, that I remembered the envelope. I got up from the couch and walked straight to the bedroom. I opened the large closet, pulled out the shoeboxes from the back of the bottom shelf, and pushed aside the cardboard box where I keep old tax returns. Behind it, leaning against the wooden back panel, was a thick manila envelope, its edges yellowed by time, bearing the red stamp of the King County Clerk's office in the top right corner. I picked it up with both hands. I felt the weight of it. 30 years of paper, carefully preserved. It was the prenuptial agreement that Margaret, my boss at the time, had insisted I get before marrying Richard. She had been married 3 times, knew the drill inside out, and when she found out I was getting married, she called me into her office with that blunt objectivity everyone respected and said, "Barbara, you own your condo outright, you have 10 years of savings, your credit is spotless. Sign this paper before you say I do. Love doesn't pay lawyer fees." I was 30. I was deeply in love. But I had learned early on that prudence and love are not mutually exclusive. I went back to her office the next day and told her I wanted to do it. She referred me to a trusted attorney. I scheduled the meeting with Richard as if it were standard pre-wedding paperwork. He complained that it was unromantic, that it was for paranoid people, that anyone who gets married planning for a divorce didn't deserve to get married. But he went, because I asked him to, and he signed it, mostly because he was in a rush to make his Saturday morning tea time with his buddies, and doing literally anything else was better than reading legal jargon. Lying on the bedroom floor that night, holding that envelope, I felt a strange, profound gratitude for my 30-year-old self, for that young woman who was madly in love but still hadn't completely turned off her brain. The next morning, I called Sarah before 8 o'clock. Sarah had been my lawyer for 15 years. She handled my personal affairs, helped me sell a property I inherited from my mom, and advised me on tax issues every year. She wasn't a family law specialist, but she had a partner at her firm, Jessica, who had been a shark in the field for decades. When Sarah heard my summary of what happened, delivered without pauses and without sugarcoating, because she knew me well enough to know I wasn't going to dramatize anything, she just said, "I'm calling Jessica right now. She'll see you today." At 10 in the morning, I was sitting across from Jessica in a conference room with a view of downtown Seattle. I placed the envelope on the table, recounted the facts in chronological order, devoid of unnecessary emotion, exactly as if I were outlining a corporate balance sheet for a project that went south. She listened without interrupting me once, the hallmark of a great attorney. Then she picked up the prenup, put on her reading glasses, and reviewed every page with the razor-sharp focus of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. When she finished, she took off her glasses, folded her hands on the table, and said a sentence that stuck with me, "Barbara, whoever drafted this document knew exactly what they were doing. It's ironclad. But we need hard proof of infidelity to trigger the specific penalty clause, because without it, he can contest the prenup claiming coercion or lack of understanding, and the whole thing will drag out in court." I went home with that word echoing in my head. Proof. I started with the joint checking account we used for household expenses. We each deposited an agreed-upon amount monthly, and the account covered bills, groceries, and condo maintenance. I requested the statements for the last 18 months and audited them line by line, using the accountants I had honed over 4 decades. What I found made my stomach turn for reasons beyond the emotional betrayal. There were cash ATM withdrawals I hadn't authorized, small enough not to trigger red flags individually, but collectively totaling almost $22,000 over the period. There were Venmo and Zelle transfers to an account I didn't recognize. There were tabs at restaurants I had never been to, on dates he claimed to be traveling for business or dealing with non-existent emergencies. There was a charge from a jewelry store in March, the month of my birthday, when he handed me a cheap bouquet of pink flowers and claimed we needed to keep things simple this year because finances were a little tight. I printed everything, organized it by date in a binder, added margin notes. Then I went to his nightstand. He kept an old iPad in the drawer that he used to read the news and check sports scores. A device he had practically abandoned when I bought him a new one the year before, but had never bothered to wipe or clear out. I turned it on. The passcode was our anniversary, because he never changed his passwords. I opened the Photos app and didn't have to look for more than 2 minutes. There were photos of him with Denise. Not family photos, not brother-in-law and sister-in-law at a Sunday barbecue. Couples photos, radiating a specific kind of intimacy that is impossible to fake. In a restaurant I recognized as being in San Diego, the city where he claimed he went alone for an equipment trade show last October. She was smiling at the camera wearing the bold red lipstick I had already associated with her, and he had his arm around her shoulder with a naturalness born of habit, not accident. I took screenshots of everything, emailed them to my personal account, forwarded them to Jessica with a message saying I had found what she needed. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his side. The pillow still held the indent of his head. The glass of water on the nightstand was half full, exactly the way he always left it. The book he claimed to be reading had the bookmark wedged in the exact same page for weeks, because he never actually read, he just liked having a book on display. I realized in that moment, with a clarity that stung in a completely different way than the betrayal itself, that I had spent 4 decades sleeping next to a man I knew far less than I imagined, that the familiarity I had confused with intimacy was actually just routine, that I had gotten so used to him without ever truly knowing him. I called Jessica and said, "I have everything you need." She replied, "Perfect. Leave the rest to me." Richard came home on Sunday afternoon with the aura of a man who had spent the entire weekend rehearsing a difficult conversation. He walked in slowly, closing the door with exaggerated care, as if making noise would somehow make things worse. He asked if we could sit down. I sat. He stood for a moment, then sat down too, in one of the living room chairs we had bought during a trip to Paris, a completely useless detail my brain registered right then for reasons I still don't understand. His speech lasted about 8 minutes. I know because I checked my watch at the beginning and the end, not out of impatience, but because I'm an accountant and tracking time is a reflex. He said the relationship with Denise started 2 years ago, that it wasn't planned, that it just happened the way he believed certain things do, as if free will were a variable that didn't apply to him. He said he loved me, that he never wanted to hurt me, that the situation simply spiraled out of control. He said the pregnancy was a surprise to both of them, but now there was a life involved and they needed to step up. And then he got to the part one knew was coming from the very beginning. He said it would be fair, given the whole situation, for us to discuss the assets maturely and civilly. That the condo was too big for me alone. That he and Denise would need the space to raise a child. That with my guaranteed retirement and my rock-solid work history, I would have no trouble starting over somewhere else. He delivered all of this in a tone that tried to sound gentle but ended up profoundly condescending, like someone proposing a business deal they find perfectly reasonable but clearly only considered from their own perspective. I let him finish completely. I didn't interrupt once. Then I stood up, went to the home office, brought back the binder I had compiled over the previous days, and set it on the coffee table between us. He stared at the binder like he didn't know whether he should touch it or not. I opened it and placed the bank statements in front of him. I walked him through every yellow highlighted line with the exact patience and precision I'd used for 4 decades explaining financial spreadsheets to corporate directors who preferred to play dumb. The ATM withdrawals. The untraceable Venmo transfers. The dinner tabs on dates he was supposedly miles away. The jewelry store in March. He turned pale but couldn't muster a single valid argument. Then I laid down the photos from San Diego. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the restaurant. It was a silence of absolute surrender, not shock. He already knew I had found out. What he didn't know was the sheer volume of evidence I had documented. I picked up the manila envelope and set it on top of everything else on the table. I explained what it was. He took it, opened it, and started reading. I watched the exact second his brain processed what his eyes were scanning, because his facial expression shifted in a way that 40 years of living together allowed me to identify with surgical precision. It was like watching someone realize the door they assumed was wide open was actually deadbolt, and always had been. He stammered that the document was ancient, that it didn't have practical validity anymore, that he didn't even remember what he had signed. He claimed he was pressured back then, that I had taken advantage of his blind trust in me. I slid a copy of the notary's affidavit across the table, complete with the signature of the independent attorney present that day, the lawyer I specifically hired and paid out of my own pocket to advise Richard prior to signing, precisely so none of these excuses would hold up in court 30 years later. I told him Jessica already had all the documents and that the formal filings would begin the following week. That he could contest it if he wanted to waste the money, that it was his legal right, but that the evidence of infidelity was comprehensive, time-stamped, and documented, and it automatically triggered the specific total waiver clause he had signed in his own handwriting in front of 2 witnesses and a lawyer who personally warned him what he was giving up. He just stared at me in dead silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he asked, in a voice I barely recognized, "What do you want, Barbara?" I answered with the exact same clarity I would have used for any objective corporate issue. "I want you to sign the divorce papers without contesting them, and I want you out of this condo in 30 days. That's it." He asked about money, about where he was going to live, about what was going to happen to him. And I told him the absolute truth. You have a salary, you have a paid-off truck, and you have Denise. From now on, you manage your own life. I've managed mine for 40 years while carrying yours on my back. Now it's your turn. He left that night with a medium-sized suitcase. The front door clicked shut, and I stood in the living room listening to the silence settle in, as if the entire apartment had just exhaled. Denise called me 4 days later. I knew the call was coming. I knew my sister well enough to know she couldn't stay quiet for long, that she'd wait an interval that felt somewhat respectful and then fish for an opening. I let it ring 3 times before picking up, not to be cruel, but because I needed a few seconds to remember who I was before hearing her voice. So I wouldn't respond from the place of the older sister who had spent her life yielding, but from the place of a 60-year-old woman who knew exactly what she had endured and what she absolutely refused to tolerate anymore. She started crying immediately. She said she knew she had messed up, that she was deeply sorry, that it was a moment of weakness, that Richard had caught her at a vulnerable time and she caved without thinking. She said I was her sister, that blood is thicker than water, that she needed me now more than ever. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I let her talk until she ran out of breath. Then I said, keeping my voice as steady as humanly possible, "Denise, I hear you. And now you need to hear me." I told her that for our entire lives, I had been the sister doing the heavy lifting. That I paid for half of Mom's funeral when she claimed she was completely broke. That I loaned her money over the years that never found its way back, without hounding her, without resentment, because I thought that's what families did. That I worked overtime, made sacrifices, never asked for a single thing in return because I was taught from childhood that my job was to give and never receive. I told her that what she did was not a moment of weakness or a lapse in judgment during a tough time. It was a deliberate, repeated choice, carried out for 2 years, inside the framework of my life, partially funded by my own joint checking account, all while she came over for dinner, hugged me on my birthday, and called me for favors whenever she needed a bailout. She tried to backtrack, saying the pregnancy complicated everything, that Richard wasn't stepping up the way he promised, that she was alone and terrified and broke. I felt that old familiar twinge, that reflex built over decades, the urge to fix it, to help, to be the rock that holds the sky up when her world comes crashing down. But this time, I recognized the reflex before acting on it. I finally saw clearly that the urge wasn't love. It was a deeply ingrained habit that had cost me dearly and yielded almost nothing. I told her I was sorry about her situation with the baby, that a child is a serious responsibility that deserves support. But the father of that child had a name, a social security number, and a legal obligation to handle the mess he created. I told her that this bill wasn't mine to pay. She asked for money. Not in those exact words, but it was woven into everything she said. That rent was late, that she didn't have steady work, that if I could just spot her for now, she'd pay me back the second she got back on her feet. I said no. I said it politely, but I said it with absolute finality. And I hung up. I walked over to the office window and stared down at the street for an immeasurable amount of time. It was an ordinary Seattle afternoon, that familiar perpetually overcast sky, people walking the sidewalks, the bus rolling by, life maintaining its rhythm regardless of whatever world was ending inside the apartments above it. And I realized I was feeling something I couldn't immediately put a name to. Then it clicked. It was wholeness. The sensation of someone who has conducted a brutally honest inventory and knows exactly what they have, what they've lost, and what they no longer need to carry. I called Sarah and asked her to cancel the automatic monthly bank transfer I had been sending to Denise for years, an allowance I called help, but which, in reality, was just an ancient form of guilt tax I paid every month without ever knowing why. Then I called Linda, my best friend of over 30 years, and asked if I could come over. She just said, "Yes, the coffee's hot." I went to her house, sat at the kitchen island I know better than most places on earth, drank the dark roast coffee exactly the way she always brews it, and told her everything from start to finish. Without a filter, without the polished PR version we use when telling stories to acquaintances. Linda listened, put her hand over mine, and said, "You are going to be okay, Barbara." I always was, but sometimes the strong ones need to hear it from someone who actually knows them. I cried in her kitchen for almost an hour. It was the best cry of my entire life. The formal divorce proceedings kicked off the following week. Richard's lawyer, a young guy who probably thought he had an easy payday on his hands before he saw our paperwork, tried a few maneuvers in the early days. He challenged the prenup's validity based on its age. He tried to argue that his client didn't fully comprehend the legal ramifications of the document when he signed it. He floated the idea of emotional duress at the time of execution. Jessica shut down every single attempt with paper. The notary's affidavit. The sworn statement from the independent attorney hired exclusively to advise Richard. And, as the finishing blow, a text message I had pulled from the iPad, sent by Richard himself to a buddy on the exact day he signed the prenup 30 years ago, stating in plain English that he signed it without reading it because Barbara was crazy about paperwork and he just wanted to make his tea time. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, short silver hair, subtle framed glasses, with the distinct aura of someone who has heard every excuse in the book and developed a flawless radar for distinguishing real arguments from pure garbage. She read the documents with intense focus, pen in hand, making notes. Then she looked at Richard's lawyer with an expression that required no words and asked if there was any factual dispute regarding the authenticity of the prenup or the evidence submitted. The lawyer stammered that he would need more time to review the new exhibits. The judge declared that the prenup was legally sound, fully notarized, signed by both parties with independent legal counsel present, and that the evidence of infidelity was date-stamped, documented, and irrefutable. She noted that the petitioner himself had put in writing on the day of signing that he fully understood what he was doing and simply didn't care to read it. She ordered the divorce to proceed immediately and entirely under the terms dictated by the prenuptial agreement. I walked out of the courthouse alongside Jessica in a silence that wasn't rooted in sadness, but wasn't exactly victory either. It was closure. That highly specific sensation when something that has dragged on for an eternity finally reaches a hard stop. Waiting for the car on the sidewalk, she turned to me and said, "Barbara, in all my years of family law, I rarely see a case this clean. That piece of paper you held onto was the most effective shield I've ever seen in a mess like this." I thought about Margaret. About how she called me into her office 30 years ago and delivered that blunt advice in the tone everyone respected. I made a mental note to send her an expensive floral arrangement. Richard vacated the condo well within the deadline. There were no dramatic scenes. No last-minute shouting matches. He packed his clothes, the sound system that he actually bought, and the massive collection of books he hoarded but never read. He left almost all the furniture, probably because he realized that arguing over end tables was a battle on a turf where he held zero leverage, or maybe he was simply too exhausted to keep fighting the inevitable. On moving day, I was across town at a park with Linda. We made a point to spend the whole afternoon out. I didn't want to be there watching him pack. Not out of weakness, but because I refused to let that pathetic image be the final memory I associated with him inside my home. I preferred to leave the space completely scrubbed of goodbyes. I came back that night to an apartment that smelled different, sounded different, breathed differently. I threw open every window. I bought a brand new mattress the next week. I repainted the master bedroom a deep sage green the first had wanted for years but he had always complained about. I didn't erase the history, I didn't pretend 40 years never happened. I just breathed right over the top of it. Denise tried to reach out a few more times over the following months. Texts I read and deleted. A handwritten note the doorman handed me. A call from an unknown number I answered by mistake, recognizing her voice within 2 seconds and hanging up. Eventually, the attempts grew sparse, and then stopped entirely. I heard through a cousin that she had the baby. A little girl. That Richard was paying child support, but it was the legal bare minimum and barely covered diapers and formula. That the two of them had completely imploded before the baby was even born, that living together became toxic the second they realized the easy money they banked on was never coming. I didn't feel a drop of satisfaction hearing that. I just felt that clean, familiar sadness, the grief of watching someone you once loved make choices that steer them permanently away from anything good. And eventually, even that sadness passed, the way everything does. There's something that happens to you after surviving a betrayal of that magnitude, especially when you're 60 years old and have enough life behind you to finally possess real perspective. You start spotting the patterns that were always there, the ones you actively chose to ignore, or were trained to overlook, or simply didn't have the emotional toolkit to recognize yet. The tiny daily surrenders you mislabeled. The concessions you called generosity, that were actually rooted in fear. The silences you called patience, that were just avoidance. An entire lifetime of playing the fixer, the shock absorber, shrinking yourself so you wouldn't take up too much space or inconvenience anyone, never asking for help so you wouldn't be perceived as weak. I spent the first few months post-divorce doing a quiet, brutal inventory of myself. Not in therapy right away, that came later, and it worked wonders. But first, alone, with a hardcover journal I picked up at a local bookstore, sitting out on my balcony with a mug of coffee, writing without editing a single thought. I wrote about my mother and how hard I tried to be the daughter she needed instead of the daughter I actually was. I wrote about Denise and how deeply I had enabled a dynamic that was fundamentally toxic for both of us. I wrote about Richard and the profound difference between loving someone and merely getting used to them, and how sometimes you spend so long doing the latter that you forget the former requires actual maintenance. The retirement I had spent years romanticizing, shared vacations with Richard, long lazy lunches, a house full of people, morphed into something else entirely. It became a revelation. The discovery of who I was when absolutely no one needed anything from me. And the answer surprised me in the best possible way. I loved the quiet. I loved waking up without an alarm and deciding over breakfast exactly what my day would look like. I loved cooking slowly, picking a movie without having to negotiate for the remote, walking down to the neighborhood park and staying as long as I pleased without having to text anyone an ETA. They were tiny liberties that sounded insignificant, but stacked together, they forged a lightness I hadn't felt in my chest in decades. I signed up for a watercolor class I had been putting off for 15 years because there was always a fire to put out elsewhere. It was an adult class, Tuesdays and Thursdays, at an art studio 10 minutes walking distance from my building. The instructor was in her 40s, possessing an unbelievable reservoir of patience and a genuine knack for making you realize things about your own psychology based purely on how you grip the brush. I was terrible the first few weeks. Too rigid, too careful, terrified of making a mistake. My paints were heavy, my strokes stiff, the resulting pictures technically correct but entirely lifeless. The instructor told me this was incredibly common for people who had spent their entire careers being precise, because watercolor demands the exact opposite of precision. It requires you to relinquish control and let the water do half the work. It took me a while to truly internalize what she meant. She wasn't just talking about the canvas. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in July, painting a scene of a window with droplets on the glass, my paint bled in a way I hadn't mapped out, creating a texture I never could have achieved on purpose. I sat there staring at it for 5 minutes before I realized I was grinning. The instructor walked up behind me, looked down at the paper, and simply said, "There it is." I started making new friends, not the kind forged out of convenience or proximity, but the kind you actively choose with intent. Linda remained my absolute rock. But I met a woman in my watercolor class named Carol, a 70-year-old retired pediatrician, who taught me more about grit and starting over in one long conversation than I had learned in a lifetime of experience. I started chatting with a neighbor on my floor I had exchanged polite nods with for a decade, who turned out to be one of the funniest, most generous women I've ever met, and she quickly became a regular companion for morning walks and lunches. I traveled alone for the first time in my life. I booked a flight to San Diego, the exact same city from the photos I found on that iPad, and I did it on purpose. Not to erase a memory, but to overwrite it with a better one. I picked the hotel myself, chose the restaurants, walked the beach at whatever hour I wanted, planning absolutely nothing for anyone else. On my last night, sitting at an oceanfront table, I ordered the most expensive thing on the menu and drank a glass of wine watching the sun dip below the Pacific. I didn't think about Richard a single time that night. I started seeing a therapist 6 months after the divorce, Dr. Bennett, a woman roughly my age who possessed a terrifying talent for asking questions that cut straight to the bone without any fluff. Working with her, I finally understood that my identity as the strong one hadn't just been forced on me, I had actively maintained it. I had anchored my entire self-worth to my capacity to carry everyone else's baggage. Unlearning that, learning how to receive instead of just outputting, learning how to take up space unapologetically, was a slow, grinding process. But it was worth every single minute. A year and 4 months after the dinner that blew up my life, my phone buzzed with a text. It was Richard. He said he wanted to apologize to me for real, face to face, not hiding behind a screen, but that he completely understood if I didn't want to see him, and he would respect whatever I decided. He said he just needed to get a few things off his chest so he could try to find some peace of mind. I sat there holding the phone for a long time, staring at his name on the screen, scanning my body to see what I felt. And what I found was almost nothing. It wasn't rage, it wasn't longing, it wasn't any high-voltage emotion. It was a calm, profound distance, the exact same distance you feel looking back at a chapter of your life that is permanently closed, viewing it with understanding but absolutely zero desire to reopen the book. I texted back that I preferred to keep it to text. That he could say whatever he needed to say right there. The message that followed was a wall of text. He confessed that he had finally realized, aided by time and ruin, that he had spent decades using me as a foundation without ever treating me like a true partner. That the incredible stability of our life was built entirely on my labor, my discipline, and my ability to fix everything, while he simply harvested the benefits without ever questioning what it cost me. He admitted that when Denise targeted him with unchecked flattery and easy admiration, he mistook it for something real, when in truth, it was just the validation he had always chased without admitting it. He said he genuinely regretted failing to be the man I deserved. I read it twice. I didn't reply. Not out of spite or lingering pain, but because the message was accurate, and the truth doesn't require my commentary. He had finally arrived at the correct conclusions. Years too late, but he got there. And that was his cross to bear, not mine. I had already done my heavy lifting regarding what happened between us. I did the work in Dr. Bennett's office, in the journal on my balcony, on those long walks. I didn't need a single ounce of closure from him to finish my healing. I saved the message and blocked his number. Not out of resentment, purely out of hygiene. Denise never reached out again after a certain point, and I never went digging for updates, beyond what filtered through the family grapevine. The little girl was growing up, named Emma, and looked healthy in the few photos circulating among relatives. For her first birthday, I sent an anonymous package through a cousin, a stuffed animal and a set of clothes. Not because I owed Denise or Richard anything, but because that little girl was completely innocent, and I refused to let her pay the toll for the catastrophic mistakes of the adults who brought her into the world. 2 years after that dinner, I was sitting out on my balcony on a gorgeous Sunday summer afternoon, drinking a glass of iced tea, the condo behind me fully renovated and styled exactly the way I had always dreamed, when my phone rang. It was Carol, my friend from the art studio. She said she had put my name forward to speak at a financial planning and asset protection seminar for middle-aged women. She asked if I was game. I sat in silence for about 3 seconds. Then I said yes. The seminar was on a Saturday morning, in a hotel conference room packed with about 60 women, mostly between their 40s and 70s. I stood up and told my story without leaving out the ugly parts, without turning it into a soap opera, and without playing the victim. I just told it exactly how it happened, including the times I messed up, the times I was naive, and the years I actively chose to look the other way. And then I talked about the prenup. About what it actually means to make legal choices to protect yourself while you are still okay, when love is still in the room and the fear of offending your partner is sitting right next to it, because that is the exact moment when building a fortress is the hardest to do, but the most vital. When I finished, a woman around 55 approached me. She told me she had been married for 22 years, that she never got a prenup because her husband guilted her out of it back then, and that she had been getting a sick feeling in her gut lately that things were falling apart. She asked if I had a good lawyer I could recommend. I gave her Jessica's card. She hugged me before she left, wrapping her arms around me with that specific grip of a woman recognizing a survivor in someone else, a connection that transcends small talk. I watched her walk out of the room, thinking about Margaret. Thinking about that rainy afternoon 30 years ago when an older, sharper woman handed me a lifeline, and I had the good sense to grab it. I thought about how many variations of that exact conversation are either happening, or desperately failing to happen, in corporate offices, in kitchens, and between friends every single day. The watercolor exhibit for my class took place a month later. It was just student artwork hung in a small downtown Seattle gallery, nothing pretentious, but real, with our names printed on the wall and everything. I had 3 pieces featured. Underneath my name, the instructor had added a small bio. I didn't write it, but it stuck, an artist who learned that true beauty appears the moment you stop trying to control everything. I stood in front of my paintings for a long time. I thought about the woman who walked into that restaurant a year and a half ago, staring at white orchids, clutching a prepared toast about gratitude, entirely convinced she was surrounded by her people. I thought about how the life she had mapped out was so much smaller, narrower, and far more dependent on the validation of others than the life she was forced to build from scratch when the floor caved in. I thought about the manila envelope sitting in my safe. About what it really stood for, not just a legal shield, but a symbol of something much older and far more foundational, a decision, made at 30 years old by a woman blindingly in love who still refused to turn a blind eye, deciding that she was worth protecting. That love didn't have to require a lobotomy. That protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's a profound act of responsibility. 62 years old. A condo I own outright, painted exactly the way I want. An honorable, finished career. Friends I chose. Watercolors on the wall. Dark roast coffee in the morning without rushing. Long walks in the park without having to give anyone an itinerary. I am Barbara. And I am finally starting to understand what it really means to be well. Now, if you enjoyed this story, click subscribe, and tell me in the comments, which part made your jaw drop. Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member for exclusive videos I don't post anywhere else. See you there.